Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so there's an emerging pattern with this guy Clavicular, who I mentioned the other week on this podcast. This is sort of a Gen Z streaming influencer who mainly streams on Kick and those type of platforms, who talks about looks maxing, which is basically just going to sometimes extreme methods to try to increase your attractiveness. Anything from taking drugs to lose weight to like body modifications or hitting your face with a blunt object like a hammer in small increments, things like that. All of it experimental and weird manosphere self-help type of guys, with this guy Clavicular, who's kind of a Patrick Bateman type, seems to be leaning into the Patrick Bateman thing, and there's a little bit of an audience for that. And anyway, this guy has these clip farms and these kind of clippers that take his stream and push them really hard on social media. So he's been going viral there and becoming this sensation that certain aspects of the media felt an obligation to cover for some reason. And so there's been a lot of talk about this guy Clavicular, and in GQ and I think New York Times. And according to him, he says that he thinks the GQ interview was fair, or that the final article was fair. But increasingly, he seems to be getting frustrated by these interviews because they want to ask him questions that have a political slant to it, or in his view, just aren't enough about this weird thing about looks maxing. He just wants to talk about like how to train your jawline to stand out more or something, when what they're curious about is like, hey, why are you hanging out with Andrew Tate and people doing like Nazi Sieg Heil salutes? So here's him talking to 60 Minutes Australia, and he eventually decides to walk out and end the interview abruptly, which he has done a couple times recently. So this is him talking to 60 Minutes Australia.
You know, in this chat, can I just say, this isn't a criticism, but you don't give off this sense that you're incredibly happy and fulfilled. I'm wondering, Clav, do you live a happy, fulfilling life?
I would say for the most part I do. I just generally don't want to be doing this right now. I had something else I had to do.
What am I keeping you from?
I wanted to go to a club.
Is that your idea of fun, going to the club?
Well, I mean, maybe it's not the most enjoyable activity, but it'd certainly be a lot more fun than this. No offense.
A lot of the things you talk about and say are very similar to other things we hear in the whole manosphere, and things that people see as rather problematic. But on that note,
2 more questions.
Of course, was born out of the incel community and movement. And do you identify with that group? How do you feel about being linked to that group of people?
Do I identify as an incel? I mean, how could you ask me that question as a follow-up after you asked me about my relationships to women? I mean, that's quite literally the worst sequence of questions I think I've ever heard.
Well, let me rephrase it then. Looks maxing was obviously a term created by the incel community. How do you feel about being linked to that group?
I'm not linked to that group in any way. Looks maxing is self-improvement, right? So it's about potentially even ascending out of that category. So that would be kind of one of the goals, is to disassociate from being an incel and overcome that. So that doesn't make sense.
You also maintain, or you've been seen with certain people who are from all parts of that world. I mean, just as an example, You've obviously shared company with Andrew Tate and other, dare I say, rather controversial figures. Why do you spend time with people like that?
Are you trying to... I see you want to make this political.
Not at all. Not at all. I'm just curious.
No, that's what you want to do.
No.
You know you have
not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I'm not.
You want to end it and talk about...
I'm just curious. No, not at all. I don't care about your politics. I know you're not political. You've said that repeatedly. I'm just, when you get seen with those people, obviously people make assumptions. I'm wondering what the thought process and motivation for you is behind.
Interview. I guess you watched the Piers interview.
I did, yeah.
Too bad I didn't have time to look into, anything about potentially, who your wife cheated with. But don't try to go down that line of questioning with me, all right? Because I'm not doing any political...
I'm not married, Clav, but I was simply only asking because obviously you've been filmed with these people.
So I could teach you about looks max, and then maybe you could switch that up. But thanks for the time. Appreciate the interview. All right.
Yeah, so Australian reporters seem to be pretty solid. There's a few instances I can think of particularly reporters from these Australian outlets doing really good investigative interviews like this. And he does ask him a lot of questions about looks maxing, although the framing is definitely like, what do you think the impact of this is? Do you think this is good for people? Is this part of some larger depressive pattern that you have? Do you think it's mentally healthy? Do you think it's good to be teaching kids about this kind of stuff? Obviously, all of that is going to fall on deaf ears with this guy because he's made a lot of money doing it, and he feels like he has a method towards like whatever, infinite wealth and infinite life or something like that. And he's going to keep going down this path. And that's why he wants to talk about the methods, because he feels like, okay, if I can get people listening to these methods that I've developed, whether it be taking certain substances in concentrated doses or whatever, then I can get them to see me as somebody who has some genuine guidance when it comes to this looks maxing thing. And reporters are, like I said, repeatedly asking him about his affiliation with people like Andrew Tate, his affiliation with the incel community, etc. And so I can understand why that's frustrating for him, because I can see it happening to him repetitively. It keeps happening in these interviews. They keep having him answer sort of the same questions about like, do you think looks maxing is bad and not good? And don't you think that personality matters more than looks and that sort of thing? So he has an answer pre-canned for that. He's had to answer that question a lot of times, but really it's because he's kind of in the wrong space with all of this stuff. And he is affiliated with these like noxious political, the incel community, the Andrew Tates, the Nick Fuentes. He's ideologically aligned with them just as much as he is socially aligned with them, and he just doesn't talk about it as much. But it does get pretty eugenicsy what he talks about, and he's clearly a right-leaning dude. And I would argue that the acceptance of him, at least among some Gen Z and apparently like some of the club scene or whatever, it seems to come from whatever this strand of more conservative, sympathetic thought is among a lot of people out there, especially people disconnected from politics. I'm reminded of that clip that went viral recently about people on the beach for like spring break or something that had no idea the war in Iran was happening. That's the type of audience that Clavicular is reaching. And so anything that they might hear about politics is going to come through figures like Clavicular. And probably the fact that he keeps getting annoyed by the fact that he has to answer political and political leaning questions and seems to get a little bit upset when faced with those kind of things is because that's not his interest. That's not really what he wants to talk about. And yet that is sort of the bubble that he's put himself in. And he really seems like he wants to be in like the wellness space or like the modeling space. I think he liked the fact that he got to like walk in some kind of modeling thing. And, I think what will be an interesting test case for him is if there's a lane for him in the modeling and fashion world, despite his conservative / fascistic leanings. So if there's a lane, I don't know much about the fashion world or the modeling world. I don't really know, but it'll be interesting to see, because that's where I think there would be a future for this looks maxing stuff. Again, not to project it on that culture, but I think it just kind of fits into that. And when you look at some of these guys who are into this stuff, the way they chisel their faces and everything, it doesn't really come off as like normal. Like, this is not a normal version of society for everybody to look like this. So it's a little bit more at home amongst people who are interested in modifying their looks, or looks maxing is a thing that human beings have done for a long time. I think that's the kind of the argument that Clavicular is making. So whether or not there's room for him among the wellness and modeling and fashion community, which has opened up to him a little bit, at least a little bit already, with not that much backlash, I think that's going to determine how much of a future this guy has. In streaming, there might be some, but the thing about that is it has to get increasingly, they have to continue to evolve whatever it is, the thing that they're talking about. So with Clavicular, I think he probably feels like he has some longevity because he can keep modifying his face and like slowly chiseling. I think his theory is that over time, if he can keep getting better and better looking, then he'll continue to have an audience forever, etc. I don't think so. I think eventually he's going to start to look pretty weird. He'll probably get desperate and start doing worse and worse things to himself. And if the whole looks maxing gimmick doesn't continue to give back, then he probably would have to go in a political direction, make the worldview that he does talk about. That's the reason that I bring Clavicular up, is because he is articulating a worldview. It's really just the incel worldview, but it's this evolved version of it, of like, there's something that at least some of you can do something about it. But it completely buys into the incel worldview and then tries to build this narrative about like self-improvement out of that. So I think that's why it means a lot to some people, this looks maxing thing. But it doesn't necessarily have legs in my view. And I think at a certain point, he's only going to be left with that worldview that he's constructed. And he's going to have to continue evolving that, which is likely to go in a more and more dangerous right-wing direction. So I think that's probably the future for this guy. And like I said, how much his theory continues to prove itself out, that if he just goes into some of these spaces and looks nice, then they will continue to give him more and more opportunity. You know, maybe that's true. We'll see. I would argue that he gets a lot of backlash, and if his theory was as true as he claims it to be, he would be able to just skate by without really answering these questions and still be beloved, and people wouldn't think twice about these loose affiliations that he has because he looks so great and he has so much guidance with the looks maxing. But that's not true. People are genuinely skeptical of this guy because things other than just your looks matter. And just to show you the other instance recently where he did an interview walk-off, he did an interview with Andrew Callahan the other week, I think, where the same thing happened. He had a long conversation with Callahan about looks maxing. They talked about different aspects of it, some of it from sort of a social aspect of like, do you think this is good or bad? But for the most part, you know, it was a pretty decent interview, but Clavicular got mad at the end because Callahan was interested in talking about some of the more political implications, even in the process of saying like, I'm not trying to put you in any box or anything here. So here's Andrew Callahan talking to Clavicular.
Yeah, not a single attempt at anything in regards to looks max.
Okay, what's a question I should ask?
Well, that's up to you. It's
Well,
like,
you're
what am I going to tell you how to do your job?
You're telling me you want me to ask you about specific scientific questions about different looks maxing methods.
Well, I mean, just...
And you're not happy with the question about the peptides or the bone smashing or anything like that?
I mean, like, can you not identify like anything that you have a curiosity about? Like maybe, you know, you wake up with dark circles in your eyes one morning and like, you know, even something like that. I mean, just like, even if you don't give a shit, I mean, like it would be like, at least, you know, you put a little bit of effort into.
I think I've done a pretty good interview.
From what like context? Because if it's from the context of what you guys reached out was your intention, then I would say that you've done a pretty shitty job.
All right, well, I think people probably want to learn about you, and that was what I was trying to give you the opportunity to do.
Well, no, I know. I think that's totally fair, and that's I applaud you for that. But not one, you know, question about looks maxing.
There's been so many questions about looks maxing. I probably asked you about looks maxing like 40 times. I just don't know the specific science. I'm not in the community.
Okay, well, I mean, like, if you were to ask about like something in regards to hair loss, like there's really nothing.
Yeah, sure, hair loss.
You see what I mean?
Telling me what to, you're trying to get
telling
me
you what to ask. So when you wake up every single morning and you take a look in the mirror, you're 100% satisfied with every single thing. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay, dude. All right, well, I guess that's just, if you want to be completely disingenuous, that's fine with me. I guess there's just no point to continue.
All right. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah, so I think the tantrums are funny. It tells me that he is frustrated in his run-ins with the media. He wants the attention, but he's getting frustrated that it's not the type of attention that he wants. It'll be interesting to see if he keeps doing interviews like this. I think his moment will mostly pass. Like I said, it just depends on the replicability of the popularity surrounding this. Is it going to continue to be compelling, or is this guy going to cease to be interesting? I think that his ability to be connected to like what is perceived as getting laid amongst the younger generation is really where the cultural power of this comes from. And there are always figures like this. I've compared him already to like pickup artists and stuff like that. It's not quite like that, but it's similar in the way that he turns interactions with women into content, and he's created this self-fulfilling prophecy around himself, similar to somebody like Dan Bilzerian, who incidentally showed up in the Epstein file with every single girl that he's with on Instagram blacked out, like the victims are blacked out in the Epstein files, implying that the girls that show up in Dan Bilzerian's Instagram posts are all trafficking victims. That's at least what it's implying, not confirming. But point being, that's the type of scene that Clavicular seems to like to create around himself, you know, beautiful women and the club and et cetera, et cetera. And that type of thing is very appealing to young guys who are trying to figure out how to get laid. They're trying to figure out what to do with themselves. And so I think that this will always exist because there's space for it. There's always going to be a club scene, and the people there are not going to be the most socially conscious, or at least that's not what they're going there for. And an argument that he makes at a point in this is that, like, being at the club, you know, some of the girls that are there are more interested in him and his looks maxing thing than they are in the feminists over in the corner. Not that there's any feminists in the corner at the club, but, you know, the image, I think, is powerful when it comes to this argument about, like, should you have a worldview that's respectful to women at all? Because he's saying, like, well, when I go to the club, they like the scene that I'm putting on and they want to hang out with me. And I think that that's powerful. And it's probably important to think about, like, how to project some kind of cultural significance in that same way. I'm reminded of what the rapper Slug from Atmosphere said about his shows, which is that it's like a communal thing where people get together, and like what you want when you're creating those spaces is for people to meet each other and fall in love and like get laid or have a good time or meet friends or whatever. Like that's the kind of communal space you're trying to create. And obviously he's not saying that is like the sole purpose of it, but he's saying that that is the purpose of social spaces in general. It kind of goes back to that argument about not having enough third spaces in our society, places where people can go where it's not necessarily about spending money, or if you do spend money, it's affordable, and you know, you can meet people and exist in the community. And I do think that's important, and ultimately, as sort of PBS as it may be, I think that's the answer to this, because the reason that the Clavicular narrative has cultural power is because of the club scene and his ability to go out and be there and look like he's getting girls and getting laid. And so the second he either doesn't look like he's doing that anymore, or there are other alternatives that seem more interesting and also accomplish the same goal of making young men and young women and young whoever more socially significant and socially accomplished, then, you know, stuff like this, the reactionary, gross stuff is going to lose its appeal in the face of better options that are less capitalistically exploitative. But as long as we don't have spaces like that, the more profit-focused spaces are going to become increasingly perverted and folded in on themselves and bizarre to look at as they continue to seek more ways to extract profit from people. And that's really all Clavicular is about, in my opinion.
When it comes to Kanye, I'm not seeing any reason to think that his beliefs have shifted even a tiny inch, but it's possible that he's back on this medication that's making him feel like it's less worth it to be the one dedicating his life to Hitler and going and Sieg Heiland and Nazi insignias and all the shit that he was doing.